We are now being joined by Ben Hodges, retired United States Army Lieutenant General and former Commanding General of the United States Army Europe. We will discuss the state of the counteroffensive and various political issues related to Russia's war in Ukraine. Good afternoon, Mr. Hodges. Thank you for joining us on here. I wanted to start with a very recent news reported by the press worldwide and in Russia of the admission made by the NATO Chief of Staff that Ukraine may be able to become a member of the alliance by ceding territory to Russia. To quote Stian Jensen, the NATO Chief of Staff, I think that a solution could be for Ukraine to give up territory and get NATO membership in return. He also clarified that Ukraine must itself decide when and under what circumstances it holds negotiations with Russia. As someone not unfamiliar with NATO, Mr. Hodges, what do you make of this? Is this a realistic possibility?
I think this is a terrible idea. That may be something that's being considered by some in NATO, but all 30 nations, all 31 nations would have to agree to this. And I think that Ukraine would have to think long and hard. What part of Ukraine do they give up? I mean, does this mean let Russia keep Crimea? I think any thinking person in Ukraine knows that this would be very dangerous, that Russia never, ever lives up to any agreement, and it would be very difficult for Ukraine to rebuild its economy as long as Russia occupies Crimea and can disrupt traffic in and out of any Ukrainian port, even Berdansk and Mariupol, once they have been liberated. So I think this is a terrible suggestion. And I think that people who think that Ukraine should give up Crimea should look at a map and should read a history book and realize that I don't see any good outcome for Ukraine.
The conversation regarding concessions seems to have come about partially from the counteroffensive turning out more modestly than many expected, both in Ukraine and in the West. There was an article in a large mainstream American newspaper suggesting that the counteroffensive should be shifted all the way over to next spring, the spring of next year. What do you think? Can we call the counteroffensive a failure already?
Well, first of all, if anybody in a U.S. newspaper says that a counteroffensive should be postponed until next spring, is clueless and has no understanding of modern warfare. Why in the world would we encourage Ukraine to stop and wait 3, 4, 5 months so that Russia could continue building more defenses, put in more landmines? That's a ridiculous suggestion by whoever said it. Secondly, I have great faith in the Ukrainian general staff. I have been impressed with how they have been so clever, so disciplined. They have adapted to a very, very difficult situation. And look, I think it's time for a little bit of a history lesson. In June of 1944, when the U.S. Or the Allies landed at Normandy on June the 6th, a successful landing, the D-Day invasion. But for 2 months, we were stuck. The Allies were stuck in this part of France because the Germans had adapted so well to the hedgerow terrain. So for 2 months, our offensive was stopped and thousands of leaders were killed, even though they had had 2 years of training. It took 2 months for us to innovate, to adapt to the German defenses there in June of 1944. And we had overwhelming air power and air superiority. And finally, we were able to break out. So when I hear people say, the Ukrainians are not using the training they got, or it's going too slow, these are people that do not understand the complexity and the difficulty of what Ukrainian armed forces are trying to do. I think in another few weeks, we're going to see a completely different situation, a much better situation.
I fully understand that no one can predict in detail what will happen next in this war. But at the same time, when we discuss the postponement of the counteroffensive, Both the American press and Russian propaganda say that the rainy season is imminent, making combat operations on the scale needed for Ukraine essentially impossible. What do you think? Does the counteroffensive of the Ukrainian armed forces have a deadline?
I think the Ukrainian General Staff knows the answer to that. They will be the best to judge what they are able to do. I think that the priority, I don't know this. The General Staff does a good job of protecting information as they should. But as I look at the situation and I look at the map, what is most important, and I always keep my Ukrainian map with me so that I can follow what's going on and understand the geography. The the objective, the priority has to be to isolate Crimea and make it untenable, too dangerous for Russian forces, so that the Black Sea Fleet cannot just sit in Sevastopol, and the Russian Air Force cannot just operate out of Saki, and Russian logistics cannot operate out of Zhenkoi. You can do that any weather if you have long-range weapons.
Mr. Hodges, we see that there is always some sort of pressure regarding Crimea. Last time we spoke to you, you said that the annexed peninsula would become a key zone of interest for the Ukrainian armed forces. But as of now, it has proved difficult to logistically isolate Crimea from Russia, as Russia is constantly responding and moving weapons into the area. Is there still a chance that Crimea's roads, bridges, railways could be cut off?
Yeah, absolutely. There's multiple things. This is what impresses me so much about Ukrainian armed forces, how innovative, how creative they are. So we see drones, Navy drones. We see use of Storm Shadow, French Scalp, and also as the land forces continue to make progress, they're going to be able to bring up more HIMARS and other systems that can disrupt the land bridge that connects Rostov down into the Zaporizhia region and down into Crimea. So constant pressure on this logistical network, I think, is having an effect. Of course, if the United States and Germany would make the decision to provide the ATACMS and Taurus and other capabilities, this would happen much sooner. But the Ukrainian General Staff, I've been so impressed with how professional they are. They are not going to just sit around and complain. They are going to find other ways to do this, because this is the key to victory, I think, is making Crimea untenable, unsafe for the Russian Navy and the Russian Air Force.
The long-range weapon systems you mentioned, ATACMS and Taurus missiles, are now a huge point of discussion. Long-range weapons are still not being delivered to Ukraine. Some say that Western leaders are afraid of Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory. How do you assess this from a military perspective, considering that Kiev has repeatedly emphasized that it has no interest in moving the full scale of military operations onto Russian territory?
So, first of all, I believe the Ukrainian government when they said, if we receive ATACMS or Taurus or these other weapons, that Ukraine would not use them against targets in Russia. If they said that, I believe it. It would be easy for the U.S. to stop otherwise. So, but I also would say that under the UN Charter, every nation is allowed to defend itself. And so, of course, Ukraine should be able to use weapons against Russian bases from which airplanes and rockets are being launched and killing innocent Ukrainian civilians. But if that's the price that Ukraine has to pay in order to get ATACMS and Taurus, I think they've made it clear. I mean, that was good enough for the UK, that was good enough for France. But I think actually this is an excuse. This is not the reason that the West, that Germany and the US are not doing it. Those are only the excuses given. The real reason is because the US administration, unfortunately, cannot or will not say that they want Ukraine to win. they have provided so much. It's impressive how much they have provided, and that they have kept 50 nations together in support of Ukraine. But the fact is, they stopped short of saying they want Ukraine to win. If they wanted Ukraine to win, then all of these excuses would be gone about, long-range weapons, about training time for F-16s, about how much fuel it takes for M1s. Those are all nonsense excuses because they can't bring themselves to deliver what's needed to win. And I don't fully understand why, but if they made that decision.
Well, why can't they muster up the courage and say it? What's the problem?
I think there's three reasons. Number one, they are overly concerned about possible Russian nuclear escalation. The Russians talk about using a nuclear weapon all the time. They have the capability. They obviously don't care how many innocent people they kill. And I think the administration is worried that it might happen, and they are overly worried. That's one reason. The second reason is that I think that there are too many people in the administration, and indeed in many capitals, that just can't believe that Russia can be defeated. They are not willing to accept that this is a real possibility. And then the third reason is I think that they don't know what to do if the regime collapses, if the Putin regime is overthrown. I don't think they know what to do. And so for these three reasons, and also maybe the Chinese are saying, do not let this happen, I think this is why.
Finally, I wanted to ask you about the drone strikes and various targets in Moscow. These strikes likely have a psychological element to them. No one is dying, there have been no casualties, fortunately, but there is an effect. In that sense, we'd like to understand how, in your opinion, such attacks are perceived in Washington. Is this strategy used by the Ukrainian armed forces approved by the United States, or is it a point of contention and perhaps one of the reasons for why requests for long-range systems have been denied?
First of all, I never hear criticism from Washington or London or Berlin or Paris about drone attacks in Moscow. I mean, maybe some people complain. I never hear it. So either our administration has approved it, or more likely, they don't have a problem with it because this is being done by Ukraine with Ukrainian developed weapons. But Ukraine does not need American approval to launch Ukrainian weapons against Moscow. Number two, I think it is a brilliant idea. It's important for Russian people to realize that they have been lied to over and over and over by their own government about what's going on in this war. They need to feel it. They need to see that Ukraine has strong capability. And I think Ukrainian people also need to see that Ukraine is striking back. You may remember that shortly after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor back in 1941, shortly after that, the United States launched a very, very dangerous long-range raid against Tokyo. And then the purpose was not to try and destroy Tokyo, but it was to send a message to the Japanese as well as to the American people that we were not going to give up, that we were not defeated, that we were going to strike back. I think the psychological impact of this is very important.
Thank you, Mr. Hodges. That was Ben Hodges, retired United States Army Lieutenant General and former Commanding General of the United States Army Europe, joining us live on TV Rain. We discussed the Ukrainian counteroffensive and various other aspects of the war.
We operated in Russia for 12 years, and the government tried to get rid of us 3 times.
We had to leave, forced out of the country by new repressive laws after the first week of the war. Our freedom crushed by the authorities.
Мы временно приостанавливаем работу телеканала.
We survived, started working from Europe, and now we are watched by millions of people every day.
There's no other independent news channel in Russian. We have now decided to tell the truth about Russia in English as well.
so that you could get news about Russia, the war in Ukraine, and Russian society directly from the source.
We want to tell you firsthand what is really happening in Russia. Subscribe to TVRain Newsroom on YouTube and let's take a look at our future together.